What do you make of this latest tactic in President Putin's war on Ukraine, attacking infrastructure, leaving many towns and villages without power?
In one sense, using missiles which are precision guided, which could have military purposes against civilian targets, is typically a sign of weakness in the military sphere. Toward the end of the war, Hitler wasted a lot of missiles attacking England, for example, rather than having to use them in a military context. So what we're seeing is that Russia is suffering military setbacks pretty much across Ukraine, but yet wasting missiles attacking civilian targets. But attacking energy infrastructure is a little bit more clever because Putin probably thinks that this might reduce the resolve of Ukrainians to continue fighting. But there's no sign that that's happening.
No, indeed. I mean, he clearly hopes that this might damage the morale of the Ukrainian people. I mean, it seems pretty unlikely that that is going to succeed.
Yes, that's correct, because Ukrainians have now become adjusted to the kind of war that Russia is waging and how brutal it is, including, the atrocities that have taken place in Bucha and elsewhere. And this has really angered Ukrainians, and it's also angered Western supporters of Ukraine as well. So the consensus in the West for strong support, military support, and financial support for Ukraine keeps growing.
And the concern is, of course, that this tactic, of course, it has claimed several lives, but it is also making life very difficult for thousands of Ukrainian citizens. And if this tactic is maintained throughout the winter, when it gets much colder, it could indeed inflict real hardship, couldn't it?
Yes, it could inflict a real hardship, and this is already having an impact in a number of areas. There was a time in the 1990s, the early 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Soviet Union collapsed when it went bankrupt, where a lot of cities, a lot of towns across the former Soviet space did not have electricity or gas to heat their homes or light their light bulbs. So this is not a totally new phenomenon, but I don't think Ukrainians ever expected to have to confront this issue again. But thus far, there's no sign that Ukrainians who are well aware that this could happen, there's no sign that they are weakening in their resolve to oppose Russia's invasion.
We're seeing that the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has gone to Washington for an urgent meeting with his US counterpart, talking about the need to bolster Ukraine's air defences. I mean, how important do you think that is?
It's important in two contexts. One is to protect Ukrainian forces on the ground, but the new dimension of this, of course, is the large-scale use of drones, and now especially Iranian drones, against civilian targets, especially the electrical infrastructure of Ukraine. So this is important. A conundrum in the air defense world, though, is that it makes sense to have a cost-exchange ratio that is reasonable. That is, a side does not want to waste an expensive air defense missile to knock down a relatively simple drone, because side can't afford that for very long. So finding new technologies, new ways, innovative ways of knocking down drones and on a cost-effective basis, that's a critical challenge right now.
What about this use of Iranian drones? Iran has apparently denied that it is supplying the Russian forces with drones, but there does seem to be a consensus amongst Western intelligence agencies that that is exactly what is happening. How should the West respond to that?
So this is a real challenge, but I think the West is probably going to try to find some new ways to raise the cost to Iran of providing these drones to Russia. What those ways are, I think probably the West is just beginning to make some decisions and consider options for that. But I would expect that there will be some mechanism that the West will use to try to raise the cost to Iran.
You mean in terms of further sanctions? Because Iran's already under some pretty tough sanctions.
It could be further sanctions. There could be other mechanisms that would reduce the ability of Iran to import and export certain things, and there could be some military countermeasures as well. Iran has some military vulnerabilities in the Persian Gulf region, and so some of those might be considered as potential areas to look for ways to raise the cost to Iran.
Let me ask you about another report in the Times today, which has suggested that President Putin could be gathering troops in Belarus and perhaps planning some form of renewed assault across the border from Belarus, which is not too far, of course, from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. This, of course, after the Russian forces were pushed back from parts of the east of the country. I mean, what do you make of these reports?
Well, it is possible that Russia is leaning on Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, to allow more Russian forces to go in. But a problem for them is that Belarusian forces may refuse to fight because they don't have any interest in risking their lives to fight against Ukrainians. Another problem is that at the beginning of the war, you will recall that Russia made a big effort to seize Kiev coming down from Belarus and from northwestern Russia, and that failed. So it would be very challenging for Russia and Belarus to combine their efforts to make a successful push down from the north toward Kiev, for example. I imagine that would not be successful.
How do you think this conflict is going to unfold in the coming months over the winter? Clearly, Ukraine was delighted with the success it had in pushing back those Russian forces from parts of the east of the country, from parts of the south. We've seen those attacks on Russian infrastructure in Crimea. But at every turn, President Putin seems to simply turn to another tactic to continue the conflict.
He might be running out of effective tactics, partly because his soldiers seem to be demoralized. They've taken very heavy losses. They've lost a lot of equipment. They've lost a disproportionate share of their best soldiers thus far. So it might be challenging for them to come up with some novel idea. The Ukrainians now have a stronger army than the Russians do. That wasn't the case at the beginning. So finding some way to take Ukrainian territory with an army that's not so strong would be a big challenge for Russia.
But the really crucial thing, clearly, which Ukraine has been reiterating today, is its need for continued support and indeed more air defences from the West. Do you think that not just the US and UK, but other nations should be stepping up their supply of these sorts of weapons?
Yes, I think that is the case. And I believe France and Germany may be among those countries, those allies, which are moving into that domain. And there is an effort to coordinate supplies of air defenses. But again, the air defenses may be too expensive to use against some of the swarms of these less expensive drones. So finding other ways to do this. The Ukrainians are already destroying maybe 3/4 or so of the drones that Russia is sending toward them, and they can do this through small arms fire and other things. So that's a fair amount of success. But additional air defenses from the West will probably be reserved for higher value targets.
Do you think President Putin can be defeated in Ukraine?
I don't make predictions. But certainly the battlefield momentum is with Ukraine now. And when we look in Moscow, we see more political, let's say, turmoil than we've seen in quite some time. We're seeing the hardliners from the ex-KGB blaming the military for the problems. We see the strong opposition to mobilization, for which Putin is likely to pay a political price. We see the economic sanctions beginning to bite more powerfully, including in sectors like the automobile sector, where semiconductors are not available in large numbers. So the stress is on the rulers in the Kremlin now are quite considerable. Some in the Kremlin might think that they can blame the military for the mistakes, but it was the ex-KGB leadership in the Kremlin that urged the war, launched the war. So we may be seeing some infighting among security sectors, parts of the security sector in Moscow. So it's a little bit too soon to tell how any of this is going to turn out, but there could be multiple factors that might lead to some change.